a lot of Theresa May's book and a lot of the interviews that she's now giving to promote her book are about repairing the damage she herself caused and trying to revise the things that people might be saying about her in history books. I don't think she's going to be very successful in this effort, but it is interesting to hear her reject or clarify what she meant by hostile environment. She's quite right. She wasn't the first person to use the phrase. The first person to use the phrase was a Labour MP, and she simply adapted it. But she did form it, and more than that, what she doesn't say here is she was wholeheartedly behind the targeting of students whose visas were maybe inadvertently irregular, throwing international students out on the assumption that they will come back and that they therefore make up a really nice statistic to give the impression that the Home Office is actually doing something. The Home Office was doing very little, and the Home Office seems to have interpreted Theresa May's hostile environment as an opportunity to go slow, and hence the huge backlog of applications for asylum. She is herself responsible. Now, she goes on in the Andrew Marr interview to say that she doesn't entirely agree with the language, the use of the words like invasion and so on, but the word invasion was being used by David Cameron when she was Home Secretary, and she didn't step in to correct it. So I think, again, she's being disingenuous. She's looking at the way the water is moving, and she realises that the current position is recognised by the British people, who she quite rightly says are an hospitable people. She's recognising that the current hostility is not going to last. It cannot last, and there will be a backlash against those people who put forward that hostile environment. And she, I'm afraid, will be seen as the author. Let's listen to what she's got to say.
Use of the phrase hostile environment was one of those things you now regret. Can you explain again to people listening why you used the phrase and why you regret it?
Yes, and I wasn't the first person to use it. In fact, previous Labour government had used it as well. And it was used to describe the environment we wanted to set for those who were here illegally. It's only fair to people who come here legally that people who are here illegally are not able to, if you like, carry on living a life as if they've come here legally. And so it was aimed at a particular group of people. What, of course, happened was it came by some to be interpreted as more generally applying to people who had come in to live in the country. And that was a mistake, because that was never what was intended.
And language is very important in these things without trying to get into the actual policy behind it and all. What do you think of some of the language being used by some of your successors, the current Home Secretary, for instance, about migrants being an invasion, those kind of things? Because language does matter.
Well, it's not the language that I would use. And I have made one or two points about some of the migration policies and that have been brought up by the government. I have particular concern about their most recent legislation and its impact on the victims of slavery, for example.
And there was another phrase used by Robert Jenrick about cannibalising the compassion of the British people, which I thought was a strange phrase.
Yes, I mean, the British people have always been welcoming to people who are refugees, who are fleeing persecution. Obviously, what we see from a lot of people migrating to the country illegally is they're economic migrants. They're not fleeing persecution in the sense that one would normally recognise a refugee. I said when I was Prime Minister at the United Nations, I think we need internationally to have a better way, if you like, of differentiating between those who are refugees and those who are economic migrants. And we need to have a look again at some of the rules that we all operate on internationally.
We're going to have a new agreement at some point with the EU on this, aren't we, to ensure that we're all applying the same kind of rules to people crossing Europe and then arriving up on the English coast.
Yes, I mean, most of the people who arrive, obviously, particularly those coming in small boats, have been through other European countries.
There you are, you see. A lot of recasting and a lot of, smudging the reality. I will never forget my encounter, and I will never forget the fact that I felt hectored by Theresa May, and I'm sure that underneath it all she's a good person. But she and Andrea led some two peas in the same pod.